President Trump held the first White House coronavirus task force briefing since April on Tuesday, and he warned the pandemic will get worse in the U.S. before it gets better. Meanwhile, administration officials and members of Congress are working on another relief bill to tackle the health and economic impacts. Skyler Henry is at the White House with more on this.
President Trump returned to the podium for regular coronavirus task force briefings as his poll numbers drop and new COVID cases in the U.S. rise.
Many countries are suffering very, very, very badly. We've done much better than most.
The presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, disagrees, saying the president's pandemic response is negligent.
He's quit on you, and he's quit on this country.
On Capitol Hill, Trump administration officials and lawmakers continue negotiations on a Phase 4 relief bill that's estimated to cost at least $1 trillion. So far, Republicans are split.
I'm alarmed that we're talking about spending another $1 trillion we don't have.
Right now, the Republicans are playing a dangerous game of chicken with pandemic relief.
Republicans say they want funding for reopening schools to be the centerpiece for the next coronavirus bill. The U.S. Surgeon General says precautions taken outside of schools will be a huge factor in the timetable for children to return to the classroom.
The biggest determinant of whether or not we can go back to school actually has little to nothing to do with the actual schools. It's your background transmission rate. Folks need to wear face coverings. Folks need to practice social distancing.
Monday, President Trump tweeted a picture of himself wearing a face mask, calling it patriotic, after only wearing one once publicly.
He's tested more than anyone, multiple times a day, and we believe that he's acting appropriately.
Administration officials say a deal on the next stimulus bill could come by the end of the month. Skyler Henry, CBS News, the White House.
All right, and Skyler Henry joins us now from the White House to talk about this. Skyler, the president's been downplaying the resurgence of coronavirus cases across the country. So why bring back these daily briefings now?
Well, Errol, good evening to you. I think in large part, if you listen to a lot of campaign experts out there, they will simply say that the president is trying to win re-election here. I mean, the president, as you mentioned, hasn't been in one of these briefings, so to speak, for the last 3 months or so. And so now the president has an opportunity to, one, have a platform to address the country on this pandemic and this issue, and he also has an opportunity to share some of that rhetoric that he would have otherwise have shared on, say, a campaign rally somewhere across the country. Now, the president hasn't had an opportunity to do those things because of the pandemic, and so these are opportunities that I think he and his team are going to look towards to get that message out, to show that he is properly addressing the coronavirus, something that he believes he has done appropriately up until this point now, but he did say that we are going to start seeing these briefings more often. Not necessarily daily like how we saw when this pandemic first started back in March and April, but he did say that these are something that we're going to start to see more of moving into the future. He did say that they won't just be on the coronavirus, mind you. He did say that he was going to talk about the economy as well. And I think it's interesting that he is going to start to do these more often here when you start to look at some of the recent polling data. At least from our CBS News Battleground Tracker poll, it shows that a lot of these states that are seeing an increase in coronavirus numbers, they are starting to have more support for the president's rival, the presumptive Democratic nominee, former Vice President Joe Biden. Those numbers are starting to go up, particularly in Texas and Arizona, states that are primarily red when it comes to presidential elections. We're starting to see that they are dead even right now at about 45 or 46% or so when it comes to who those voters in those states will likely vote for in November. So now you see the president taking this opportunity to address the coronavirus in the entire country, but particularly in those states as well. It's also, I should also point out that the president was much more measured than he has been in recent weeks in terms of his statements today. He had a completely different tone. A lot of the rhetoric that he used today was something that we did not hear from him for the past few weeks when it comes down to things like wearing masks. He said that he wants everyone to wear a mask, and he used the quote. He said that wear one whether you like it or not, because because they have an impact, and we need right now everything that we can get. Errol, as you also mentioned, he did say that things in the country will get worse before they get better when it comes to dealing with the coronavirus altogether. But he did sound optimistic about the progress in terms of finding a vaccine and also treatments such as remdesivir and steroids for treating those with the coronavirus. But now you're starting to see a much different approach from the president in terms of the rhetoric that he decided to use, and just him kind of following the script there, when before I think a lot of us are more accustomed to seeing him kind of shoot off the cuff a little bit when it comes to his remarks, particularly when dealing with the coronavirus.
Right, President Trump saying wear a mask whether you like it or not certainly says a lot. Talk to us about this new relief package being discussed and put together. So many Americans are suffering right now. President Trump's in favor of adding a payroll tax cut to it, but is that really a priority for Republicans in the Senate? And how are Democrats even responding to Tuesday's preview of the bill?
Yeah, well, if you let Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell tell it, that remains to be seen up until this point. He said that several Republicans have differing opinions on whether a payroll tax cut is appropriate. He said that he and Republicans are still working with the administration in terms of finalizing plans before they produce a bill of their own. But if you listen to Democrats, they say that they are relatively frustrated by the lack of quote-unquote preparation up until this point. The Dems have put together that HEROES Act that we saw 2 months ago, and they've kind of just been sitting and waiting for a Republican response to this because they see this as an opportunity to help the country as quickly as possible. Obviously, Republicans do too, but if you let Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, they had remarks earlier today, and Schumer said that he felt as though the Republicans were in disarray up until this point, and he felt as though they were still, quite frankly, broad strokes in terms of how they are planning to deal with their bill proposal in terms of coronavirus relief and spending and things like that, as opposed to specifics. But what he and Pelosi did say was that they felt as though that their proposal, the Republicans' proposal, was largely aimed to help corporate America and not Americans, and that a huge chunk of the benefits in this bill will actually go toward the wealthiest Americans throughout the country there, and not necessarily those who need it the most. Also, a part of that, it remains to be seen whether the lawmakers are going to address these unemployment checks that people have been getting, these $600 unemployment checks that are set to expire at the end of the month. We heard Mitch McConnell say that that's not something that he is rolling out in terms of their plan, but of course Democrats will probably rebut that with some sort of plan of their own, and so it remains to be seen how they plan on addressing this moving forward.
I want to switch gears and speak about the census, because last year the Supreme Court blocked the Trump administration from adding a citizenship question to the census survey. How is the White House justifying its new move to exclude undocumented immigrants, as President Trump said, when redrawing congressional districts? And you also wonder, without a citizenship question, how would it be clear for officials to figure out whether or not someone is in the country legally?
Right. Well, that's the part of this that kind of remains unclear up until this point. It's like, how are you going to figure out who is undocumented and who is here illegally or not? But still, though, many of the critics of this executive order here say that what the president is doing here is unconstitutional, quite frankly. The president is justifying this and saying that the apportionment, so to speak, that comes from this is going to be for people who are legally here. Now, a lot of these areas where we are seeing, quite frankly, undocumented workers are in Democrat-run states and cities and areas. And so we're starting to see a lot of those lawmakers come out to say that the president's choice was unconstitutional. But the thing you have to remember here, too, is that the census is basically how they decide the seats that are going to be in Congress. And, from what Democrats have been saying is that regardless of whether people are here legally or not, it still is important to account for the people who are in those areas so there can be the appropriate amount of representation in those areas. Now, the Trump administration, of course, has said that that simply will not be the case there. So it remains to be seen how this will exactly play out here. We do know that the Commerce Secretary will report the undocumented findings to the president once the census is completed, and then the president will take what is reported from the census and then subtract the undocumented numbers from that in terms of how he decides to move forward in terms of this laying out the landscape here, so to speak, in terms of setting out the seats in Congress here. So that part of it remains to be seen in terms of how they plan to actually go about figuring out who is here illegally and who isn't. But it should be interesting to see how that happens. We also learned, this is a hat tip here to one of our reporters here, that the House Oversight Committee is actually holding an emergency hearing next week to talk about this, to see whether this is unconstitutional or not, and to see how this plays out moving forward here, Errol.
All right, Skyler Henry covering a lot of ground there for us at the White House. Always great to see you.
All right, buddy. Thank you.
Now, the